But now over to Luc van Loon. Professor Luc van Loon holds a chair in physiology and exercise and nutrition at the Maastricht University Medical Center. For the ones, Maastricht in the south of the Netherlands, a beautiful country, where I also met Luc a couple of times. He runs large research studies with a large research group on the impact of exercise and nutrition on health. And he covers lots of population, from sports sciences to geriatric studies to studies on the intensive care unit. And it's not only that Luc is working at the Maastricht University, but also he has a visiting professorship at the Free University of Brussels. That's in Belgium, of course. And he is also active in Australia at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. And I think to really showcase how much work Luc van Loon is doing for the field, he has more than 400 peer-reviewed articles with 20,000 citations or even more in his H index, which is a little bit a measure of, for good somebody, is 80, which is absolutely fantastic. And that's not all. He is also very active in several media and really tries to inform and educate the general public. And today we are very fortunate to have Luc here to tell us everything about muscle and healthy aging, hopefully. Luc, nice to have you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that very short introduction that you were supposed to keep short.
I said it will be short.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to present something on the anabolic resistance of aging, one of the topics that we are actually working on in the lab. And yeah, that's from Maastricht University, but as you said, I also have appointments at the Free University of Brussels and the Australian Catholic University, Melbourne. So my research group is mainly interested in skeletal muscle tissue. And why skeletal muscle tissue? Because it's such an interesting tissue and it's very dynamic, and that makes the tissue so interesting. And what is dynamic? Dynamic means that it's constantly being synthesized and broken down. So skeletal muscle proteins are broken down on a daily basis and build up again. And this is a benefit because it allows us to recondition skeletal muscle tissue. And this turnover happens at a rate of 1 to 2% per day, meaning that basically in 50 to 100 days, you completely turn over your muscle. And that allows you to actually modify skeletal muscle tissue. And that is, of course, a benefit if you, for example, perform different types of sports. If you do resistance type exercise, you will start to look more like the guy on the right. And if you do a lot of endurance type exercise, you will start to look more to the guy on the left. So different types of exercise have an effect on muscle reconditioning. Now that is a benefit, but of course there's always a drawback as well. The plasticity of muscle also makes us very, very vulnerable to muscle loss. For example, if we become immobilized, when we become older, or when we develop disease like cancer, cachexia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, we generally see muscle loss, both in quality as well as in mass. And then we call it deconditioning. But in many cases, it's just a reconditioning to a less favorable change in our lifestyle. So the big question is, why do we think we maintain muscle? So what is muscle mass maintenance? And how is this regulated? Depending on the fact that we have such high turnover rates. Now, we don't notice we actually are capable of maintaining muscle because every day we encounter anabolic stimuli that stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and therefore we are capable of maintaining muscle. Now, there's two main anabolic stimuli, and one is nutrition. It's the protein in our diet that provides us with amino acids, which are also the building blocks for our muscle. But it's interesting that these amino acids are more than simply building blocks. They're also signaling molecules that directly activate anabolic pathways that stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Now, on a whole body level, of course, the regulation of postprandial muscle protein synthesis, or the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis after food intake, is much more complex because it varies from protein digestion and all the networks and regulatory pathways there, the amino acid absorption, because all the protein that is being digested needs to be absorbed. Then the amino acids are absorbed, but only a part of them are actually released in the circulation. Then it depends on the hormonal response, with especially the insulin opening up the vascular beds in insulin-sensitive tissues to allow the amino acids to actually go to the muscle of interest, or the tissue of interest, in this case muscle, so postprandial perfusion. Then the amino acids might reach the muscle where they set off these anabolic pathways, resulting in a stimulation of myofibrillar or contractile protein synthesis rates. So you need both the building blocks, but you also need the signaling pathways to be stimulated, and those two have to go hand in hand in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Now, you can study these things in vivo in humans by infusing labeled amino acids, stable isotope labeled amino acids, taking blood samples to see how many of a specific amino acid is labeled in the circulation, and then taking muscle biopsies repeatedly, taking out the muscle protein, even the specific muscle protein fractions, and then measuring the myofibrillar protein and how much of the amino acids were actually incorporated between two different points in time. And that allows you to assess muscle fractional synthetic rates, so muscle protein synthesis. Of course, if you really want to study all the way from digestion all the way down to muscle protein synthesis, you need those labeled amino acids not only infused in the body, but also integrated or embedded into the food that you ingest. Now, you can do this, but it's a bit of a logistical nightmare, because what you start doing is infusing those labeled amino acids, for example, in a cow. And if you infuse these labeled amino acids in a cow, the cow can actually produce milk with these labeled amino acids incorporated. And then you can extract the protein and use that in clinical human experiments. And that allows you to study all the way from digestion and absorption all the way to myofibrillar protein synthesis. Now, this gives you a lot of interesting options. This is the setting of one of those experiments where Tim here is actually ingesting 20 grams of protein, and then we're actually tracking it all throughout the body, all the way down to muscle protein synthesis. So Tim ingests 20 grams of protein. Because we see the amino acids that were in the protein being released in the circulation by taking blood samples, we can actually take arterial and venous blood samples to see how many of those amino acids are extracted by the leg. And by taking muscle tissue samples and taking out the protein, dissecting it back to amino acids, and then counting the amino acids that are labeled with mass spectrometry, we can actually assess muscle protein synthesis and even the synthesis rate from the protein that was ingested. Now, you can make pictures like this. On the left, you see basal muscle protein synthesis, about 0.03% per hour, and it increases simply by ingesting protein. So you see a stimulation by nearly 40% of muscle protein synthesis that is retained for up to 5 hours after a meal. I think the right picture is even more interesting to show you what happens with the protein you ingest. The protein that you ingest is actually digested and absorbed, the amino acids are released, and they're being used to build muscle. And here on the right, you see the incorporation of dietary protein-provided amino acids into your muscle. And of course, we can detect it already 2 hours after your meal, and that increases over time, of course, further up to 5 hours. In other words, this is an interesting, invasive, and complicated study simply to show that your mom has always been right when she told you that you are what you eat. In fact, you are what you just ate. And we can detect it as early as 2 hours after a meal. Now, you can do all these interesting studies to see what effects of what are the different factors that modulate postprandial protein synthesis. And it ranges from the dose of protein, the type of protein, to the meal distribution, even the body position, the mastication, the chewing of your food, but also the processing that happens, for example, in a factory before you get a product. And so there's a lot of different factors that can modulate the capacity of a meal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Now, this is in a nutshell the impact of nutrition. I said there was 2 anabolic stimuli. The other anabolic stimulus is muscle contraction or physical activity. Muscle contraction, whether it comes as ADL, daily living activities like shopping or gardening, or specific types of exercise like endurance or resistance type exercise, muscle contraction stimulates muscle protein synthesis and can do so for up to 24 hours or even longer after the exercise bouts. Now, it becomes really interesting if you combine the effect of exercise and nutrition, because there's a synergy between them. I actually like this study to actually show you what happens after you ingest a meal. In gray, you see after ingestion of the meal, an increase in muscle protein synthesis with peak levels achieved about 3 hours after the onset of the meal, and then it wears off again to 5 hours. However, if you're physically active before you ingest the same meal, you see a further increase in muscle protein synthesis, which is also sustained over a more prolonged period of time. In other words, physical activity, muscle contraction, makes your muscle more sensitive to the anabolic properties of amino acids. Now, there is also an efficiency effect. So if you use the intrinsically labeled protein from the infusion of stable isotopes in cows, you can actually detect how much of the ingested protein is converted to muscle. And that's what you see in this picture in young and active older people. This is in blue the amount of amino acids that are used for muscle protein synthesis from the ingested source. If you're active before you ingest the same amount of protein, you see that more of that protein that is ingested is actually converted to muscle. So even if you eat the same, more of the protein can be used for muscle protein synthesis when you become active. And of course, this is something that I use a lot by explaining that we shouldn't feed people when they're lying in bed all day if it's not necessary, because more of the protein can be used if you're actually active before the meal. So I only need you to remember 3 things. And the first one is you are what you just ate. And the second thing is, if you're physically active before you ingest food, you're more of what you just ate. Now, this is something that we apply, of course, in sports nutrition, but it's hardly being used in clinical care. And that is something that needs to change. Because now we're going to talk about muscle deconditioning. We see muscle loss when we become older, then we call it sarcopenia, and we see it at an accelerated rate when we become sick, when we have, for example, cancer, cachexia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, or cardiovascular disease. What is causing this muscle loss? Now, of course, you can actually think of many reasons, but one of the things, and focusing now on aging, is there are a few studies by the late Mike Rennie showing that if you provide essential amino acids, you actually see that the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis in the young is much stronger than in the elderly. In this case, it was 10 grams of essential amino acids, so the equivalent of 10 grams of high-quality protein. We see a maximal stimulation here in young participants. However, this was not achieved in the older population. This is the reason why they came up with the term anabolic resistance, a reduced capacity to respond to anabolic stimuli in the elderly. Now, it took us quite some time to confirm that under normal postprandial situations where you ingest protein. And that's where we use that intrinsically labeled protein in young people, nicely seeing again the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis after the ingestion of 20 grams of protein in the young population. But in an older population, we actually saw a much blunted anabolic response to feeding. So again, even after a normal postprandial amount of intake protein, we see evidence of anabolic resistance. So the concept of anabolic resistance is there, but what is causing anabolic resistance? And of course, it becomes complicated again, because it could be a numerous amount of physiological factors that are responsible for anabolic resistance. It could be issues with protein digestion, the absorption, maybe the hormonal response to the feeding, the opening up of the vascular beds, the microvascular perfusion, or the uptake of amino acids, or maybe something inside the muscle in the anabolic signaling response, or the synthesis response itself. So a lot of different factors that could explain the anabolic resistance of feeding in the older population. Comparing young and old populations gets difficult because, of course, in lifestyle, there's numerous differences between a young and an older person, including habitual physical activity, lifestyle, food intake, the presence of obesity, age itself, maybe inflammation, etc., medication use. But I already told you that physical activity makes your muscle more sensitive to the anabolic properties of amino acids. Doesn't it make sense that a decline in physical activity makes your muscle less sensitive to anabolic stimuli? And of course, that would make perfect sense. And you can study this quite easily. You actually take young, healthy volunteers and you immobilize one of their legs. And you can do that for a week or 2 weeks, but even a short period of time, you can actually study what inactivity does on the anabolic sensitivity. Now, I don't have to tell you which leg was in the cast. but even 1 week of immobilization has a tremendous impact on your muscle mass. And obviously, you see which leg had been in the cast. Now, how do you explain that muscle loss? And for a large part, you can explain that muscle loss by a reduced sensitivity to anabolic stimuli. Because if you feed that person some protein, you see that the leg that was previously immobilized has a much lesser sensitivity and much lesser response to food intake. And that is definitely anabolic resistance. And this is what you see here. This is not the difference between young and old, but this is the difference between previously immobilized and not immobilized, a 30% reduction in the anabolic response to feeding. So I told you that you are what you just ate, that if you become physically active, you're more of what you just ate. But when you become less active, you are less of what you just ate. And of course, that is something that is happening as we become older and when we become ill. So what is the clinical relevance of these things? Because these studies are basically for nerds, looking at the mechanisms that are responsible for the muscle loss and the muscle gain and the reconditioning. But what is the clinical relevance? The clinical relevance, of course, is that muscle has a high plasticity, and at any age, as long as we live, we can actually increase muscle mass and strength. There might be some hurdles to take, but the muscle itself retains its plasticity and it's not declined. We can increase endurance capacity, so we can also increase the quality of the muscle. And of course, if we increase the muscle mass and the quality of the muscle, we can also increase the functional capacity and therefore the capacity for functional maintenance of functional capacity in the older population. But of course, it requires physical activity and it requires proper nutrition. Now, we know that if you actually do a meta-analysis on different studies, that if you combine physical training, exercise, resistance type exercise training, with ample food, whether it's provision of supplements or actually changing the diet so there's ample protein available, well distributed over the day, we see greater gains in muscle mass and also greater gains in muscle strength throughout training. In fact, if we go to the populations that are actually at the under level of protein intake, the frail elderly, we see that only when we provide sufficient protein, in addition to their suboptimal diet, we actually see an increase in muscle mass, and otherwise we don't see it. Now, that doesn't mean that the exercise was not effective in the group not receiving additional protein, because they still got stronger. But of course, you want both stronger, but also more muscle, because in the long term, that will help you also gain more strength, but also protect you from metabolic disease. So even though we know that after long training and the proper nutrition, you can gain muscle, you always have to be aware that you can easily lose muscle. And even 1 week of bed rest shows you that you can, even if you're healthy, 1 week of bed rest because you're getting a new hip or a new knee, you will actually lose about 1.4 kilograms of meat, flesh, muscle. Now, this is the representation of the loss of 1.4 kilograms of muscle. And this is actually then converted or translated into steaks. This is the amount of muscle that you would lose in a single week of immobilization, so bed rest. So you're not sick, you're still eating, but you just stay in bed for a week. And this is the amount of muscle that you lose. Now, why is that important? Because most older patients are typically hospitalized for 5 to 7 days. And so they are prone to losing this kinds of muscle. And we believe now that the traditional view on muscle loss, like a slow, gradual decline in muscle, is not really what is happening. Those are demographic data. The reality is that people lose muscle in short periods of reduced physical activity, which they don't fully regain afterwards. And then net with every successive short period of immobilization or bed rest or illness, they actually lose they lose muscle and don't regain it completely. So this is the catabolic crisis model. Short, successive periods of reduced physical activity that lead to muscle loss, which superimposes it towards real muscle loss, and at the end, functional loss of functional capacity. So nowadays, colleagues and myself believe that short periods of bed rest following disease or injury contribute substantially to the loss of muscle mass with aging and might be largely responsible for the loss of muscle mass with aging that we see on the population base. Now, is there any evidence for that? Because the studies that we're showing are, of course, all models. Now, if you look at people, older people getting a new hip or new knee, so elective orthopedic surgery, we actually see exactly the same amounts of muscle loss in these patients as in the models of bed rest or immobilization, despite the fact that we have physical therapy getting them out of bed within 24 hours. But the whole spectrum of 5 or 7 days of admission, massive amounts of muscle that are being lost. So we can do lifestyle interventions to gain muscle, but we also have to attenuate the muscle and strength loss during those short periods of immobilization or reduced physical activity. And of course, we do that by optimizing nutrition. And there's a lot to optimize, where various organizations plea for the protein intake of 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day, or even more. In reality, people in the hospital receive about 0.8 grams per kilogram body mass per day. Now, you can easily increase that, but it's not what they consume. If you actually see what food they consume, they're actually consuming only 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. Because the day of surgery, they hardly consume any food. And as you can see here, with each successive day after the surgery, it only increases in the end up to the 0.8 grams per kilogram body mass per day. So we need to find ways to increase protein intake and actually just try to maintain protein intake at least to the level that they are used to before hospitalization. Because we know that a reduced protein intake will actually expedite or accelerate muscle loss. Now, simply giving supplements is not necessarily the solution, or the generic supplements, because what we need to do is at a lower energy intake, we need to get more protein. So we need to consume a more protein-dense diet. That could be done with supplements or with more protein-dense products. But in fact, at a lesser amount of foods, we need to get more protein in order to maintain or at least regain the same amount of protein intake as prior to hospitalization. Of course, the other part is physical activity, because the other thing that happens when we become admitted or become ill is that we start lying down a lot, even if it's not necessary. For example, in the hospital, during hospitalization, we still spend more than 80% lying in bed. And it doesn't take me, anywhere in the world where I give a presentation and I ask where the TV is in the hospital, they will tell me that the TV is actually hanging above the bed. That is something that needs to change. We need to become more active while we're hospitalized. Of course, there will be some patients that are bedridden, but most patients aren't. So we need to make transitions from bed to table. We need to eat not in bed. We need to recreate in bed. The bed is only used or should be used to rest or sleep. Of course, we can also do some exercise, even if we're bedridden. We don't need any fancy equipment to do that. Simply transfers and short bouts of exercise or of habitual movements will probably already be enough to maintain or attenuate muscle loss. However, what you always need to ascertain that after hospitalization, you might have been able to attenuate some of the muscle loss, but you will definitely have strength loss. So always after hospitalization, regain strength. And the only way to regain strength is to do a proper rehabilitation. And that requires the recruitment of type 2 fibers. Those are the fibers most sensitive to muscle loss. And that means exercise with a higher intensity. It means getting up from the toilet, standing up. It means walking stairs. It means not simply walking, really recruiting the more heavier types of physical activity. And of course, you can do that with resistance training or with supported ergotherapy at home. That brings me to some conclusions that protein ingestion and muscle contraction, it's certainly not rocket science, both stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Physical activity makes the muscle more sensitive to the anabolic properties of protein ingestion, so definitely a synergistic benefit there. But the opposite is also true, that physical inactivity makes the muscle less sensitive. And this is exactly what happens in the hospital. We eat less, we exercise less, and both of them actually make the situation much more dramatic. We need protein to support muscle deconditioning in both health and disease, so ensure that protein is sufficient in the diet and preferably at least maintained at the level that somebody was used to before hospitalization. So what can we do to attenuate muscle loss during a period of disuse, whether it's in a hospital or at home, is to remain physically active as much as possible. Again, no rocket science there. If very locally or when there's a comatose condition, we can use exercise mimetics like electrical stimulation, but certainly when there's still voluntary contraction possible, that is always preferred. Consume a more protein-dense diet, because when you eat less and you want to maintain the absolute amount of protein that you were used to consuming, then of course the diet becomes more protein, should become more protein-dense. And even if you manage to maintain as much muscle as you can, you still have to commit to an active rehabilitation program to regain strength in those type 2 fibers and get you back at the same functional capacity level as prior to sickness or hospitalization. And then I'll just end up with thanking some companies we work with, but also a lot of academic institutions that we enjoy working with. And if you have specific questions, ask Andrea, not me. No, you can always address me by our website, where you can find all the different PhD students in our group, the theses that have been published, and the publications that are there, or the techniques that we use. So if you can get some information from there, be my guest. And thank you for listening, hopefully.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you. As always, a brilliant presentation, really going from the mechanisms and the molecules being involved towards the clinical practice. But look, aren't you, with your great work, not solving actually a very huge problem? And I would summarize it as a failure of our body, that our body is actually turning over the muscle by 1 to 2%. And so why do we have, in God's sake, so much plasticity of our muscle? And is there an evolutionary, is there a reason for that?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you can actually use one of your the sayings that your mom probably also used is use it or lose it. And that is exactly what is actually efficient, because why walking around with a lot of muscle that you're not using? So the loss of muscle, which is a very energy demanding organ, should not be there if it's not being used. So you really can accommodate your lifestyle with the amount of muscle. So your body adapts to the things you do. If you do less, you don't want all that muscle around, because it's actually preventing you from consuming the least amount of energy. But our problems these days is actually consuming too much energy. So from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense to not carry around muscle that you're not using.
I get that, but that's then absolutely not adapted to our Western lifestyle, I would say. If I summarize that, the anabolic stimuli are two, and that's nutrition and that's exercise. And I, as you know, I lived for a long time in the Netherlands, and when do we eat a big meal? That's actually in the evening. Whereas in Asia, where we are here, we are eating much more during lunchtime. So would you therewith say what the habits are in families very often in the Western communities is very not good for muscle health?
I think I mean, based on the literature so far, the research so far, it seems the most efficient to have 20 grams of protein with each main meal, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and maybe a pre-sleep snack. Now, in Western world now, generally there's a huge evening meal, but I mean, we're about the same age, I think. So when we were young, actually, we had supper or dinner in the afternoon. And so that has also changed. But in the US, for example, the dinners are generally composed of a huge amount of protein compared to the other meals. Most societies, the breakfast is very low in protein. So if you want to change something, take it off of dinner, put it in the breakfast, so you get a more evenly distribution of protein throughout the day. Theoretically, that should give you the most anabolic stimuli, because you need to get a certain threshold level with each main meal.
Yeah. So I think my question would then be, as a middle-aged individual, how much protein should you actually take? We have the recommendations for hospitalized individuals, but what is an optimal protein intake for a middle-aged individual, and then maybe also stratified and given in a couple of meals over the day?
Yeah, there's always a confusion on what is necessary and what is optimal. If the WHO says 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body mass, you can actually live perfectly with that, possibly even less if you're used to consuming less protein. But the problem is that for an optimal amount of protein to support, for example, reconditioning, you actually require more protein. So if you're a middle-aged person wanting to do a more lifestyle intervention with more physical activity, then it would clearly go towards 1.2, 1.5 grams per kilogram body mass per day. Healthy, active elderly generally consume 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to go taking supplements and all of that. If you become more active, you automatically consume more protein. So if 10 or 15 energy% of your diet comes from protein, you automatically consume a lot more protein when you become more active.
And does it matter what kind of protein? Is that plant-based diet versus meat, etc.?
Yeah, so high quality protein, of course, is the best if you have a low level of protein intake, because quality becomes more important when you actually consume lesser amounts. If you consume lesser quality proteins, like a lot of plant-based proteins, also in the matrix of plant-based whole foods, which gives you an issue with digestibility and the extraction of the protein by your body, you would actually need a little bit more. So the best is, of course, high quality, but you can compensate for lesser quality by simply ingesting more protein.
So everybody, if you want to know what's good quality, please send an email to Luc. I think, okay, that's one part. I think the exercise part is also very inspiring. So you have of course, the endurance training, then you have the resistance exercise, etc. Is just resistance exercise, is that enough? Or do I need endurance? And what is the magical intervention to maintain muscle, first of all, and then maybe another case, how to increase muscle mass? Very
good question. Of course, you need both, because muscle quality and quantity are both important. And I would always base the ratio between endurance and resistance type exercise training on the question or the limitations that the patient or the person of interest actually encounters. For example, if you have, a 45-year-old obese professional that sits in his car in meeting rooms all of the day, the first thing that you like that person to lose fat mass. So you will actually prescribe a caloric restriction and a lot of endurance type exercise to support that caloric restriction. Resistance type exercise of lesser important, because simply getting up with his big belly every time from the car is already a lot of resistance training. So in this case, it will be like 80% endurance training with 20% resistance type training to maintain muscle mass. For an older 85-year-old lady that is at risk of being institutionalized because she can't get up from the toilet by herself anymore, of course, resistance training is more important, because she isn't obese. She simply has the strength issue that is limiting her and her functional performance. So in that case, you would probably say something like 80% resistance type training and maybe 20% endurance training. So that ratio should depend on the help question from the volunteer or the patient.
Yeah. Let's keep the patients aside and the normally aging population. We know from epidemiological studies that muscle mass and especially muscle strength is associated with outcomes, bad outcomes, even in healthy individuals. So I'm asking myself very often, what is an optimal strength and what is an optimal mass for an individual? And how do you measure that to actually then increase, if you would like to, your muscle mass and muscle strength?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because you know that everybody's built in a different way. So the capacity to gain a lot of muscle depends on the type of body build that you are. So I don't think there are there's no specific guidelines on what is the best amount of muscle. I think we have to focus on the absence of an excess amount of fat mass. That's one. And optimizing muscle mass to sustain the functional capacity that you have ambition to. Of course, the measuring, I think on a person-to-person base, it's more important to see changes over time, especially over the lifetime. In that case, things like whole body MRI are of course perfect, but those are challenging and difficult and expensive. But the next thing would be CT and DEXA, but still, for some people that is too far out from a professional, but also from a financial perspective. But bioimpedance gets even closer to the functional use, but also simply body weight and proxies for fat mass.
Yeah, and where does physical function sit?
Yeah, I think what we always need to remember is that physical function or strength or functional performance is actually more susceptible to changes than muscle mass. So also with disuse, but also with aging, we see that the loss of muscle strength is greater than can be based on the loss of muscle mass. So in other words, there's also a neuromuscular component. And you notice yourself, if you go to the gym, you will notice that within a few weeks, you can actually stack more weight on the gym apparatus. But then you notice that you don't see anything happening on your body, and then you just resign, or you don't show up at the gym anymore. But in fact, is what the body does first becomes more efficient in allowing the strength to be generated. If you actually tell your body continuously, I need more strength, then in the long term, the body will start making more muscle. But of course, it won't do that immediately because that's not energy efficient, because making muscle also costs a lot of energy. So the first thing that will happen, both in gaining muscle strength and gaining muscle loss, is the changes in muscle strength. So actually doing the work is important, and that means using those type 2 fibers. And that means only walking is not enough. You have to walk the stairs. You have to sit up from a lower level, so get up from the toilet several times, stuff like that.
So before going to Clarissa Lim, who has, I think, lots of questions of the audience, my last question would be, look, as a clinician, we often prescribe protein supplementation because there is a poor appetite, etc. And let's get the proteins in, and then it sits there next to the bed. So how do we change clinical practice?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about hospitalization, as I showed you before, we provide 0.8, but only 0.5 are consumed. If that supplement is provided after your meal that you haven't even finished, you can imagine how much of that product is actually being used. So what we need to do is, at least what I think, is that we need to integrate supplementation into the meals. Whether we do that with fortification of the products and the meals, or whether we actually just make new products, or we use existing protein-dense products, all possibilities. But the main thing is frequent meals throughout the day, snacks available, and high quality, healthy, and tasty. Otherwise, they're not consuming it. Simply getting more on the plate is not the solution. And that's already shown before.
Yeah, and get moving and get out of the bed and have incentives to walk and to talk and to go.
Like home. I said, even with a suboptimal amount of foods, you will use more for muscle protein synthesis when you become active. So that's one of the first things to do.
Yes. So let me introduce Clarissa Lim to you. Clarissa is a research assistant in our center and does lots of studies regarding exercise and endurance training, especially in women. Clarissa, do we have questions from the audience?
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you, Prof. Luc, for the interesting talk. Indeed, we have so many questions from the audience tonight. So let's get started with our first question from Colin, who asked, does 16-8 fasting to feeding affect muscle mass growth, even when one supplements with 20 grams of protein after workout? And is there any evidence in elderly?
I think that is a great study design to do. I mean, there's a lot of questions now about intermittent feeding, for example, and intermittent fasting, and how that affects muscle mass. Because you can imagine if you have long periods of fasting, theoretically, that could actually just reduce muscle protein synthesis and therefore result in the loss of muscle mass, especially under a caloric restriction. Yeah, I mean, there's now studies coming out, but I would guess that supplementing protein is one option. But I think that if you have resistance type training with intermittent fasting or intermittent feeding, depends how you call it, I actually think intermittent feeding sounds better than intermittent fasting. That if you combine it with resistance type exercise training, you can prevent the muscle loss. So that's a way to prevent the muscle loss when you're, for example, skipping meals.
And may I just ask, Luc, is that across all age groups, or does it really depend if you're young and older? Where's the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult because the evidence isn't there. I would actually expect that the evidence is, or that the impact would be greater in the elderly than the young, because the clinical impact is, of course, greater. Most people that do intermittent fasting or intermittent feeding, the main aim is to lose weight, to lose fat. And so for young people, I don't see an issue. But if you start prescribing intermittent fasting or intermittent feeding to the elderly with the intention to improve health, then I'm a little bit scared because I don't want them to lose muscle.
Thank you, Prof. Luc, for the answer. So we have another participant who would like to find out what would happen if we take too much protein than what is recommended while we are immobile. Is there a maximum amount of recommended protein intake while someone is immobile?
Yeah, so in overall, we have not, I mean, there's no data to show that protein will actually have, or a huge amount of protein will have major health effects. I mean, there's been reports on kidney function and all of that stuff, but there's actually absolutely no proof. But what you need to understand is that what is a lot of protein? So everything that I just presented on is not increasing protein, but maintaining protein intake at the healthy level, and not letting it go down, even though total food intake will go down. Imagine, for example, the Tour de France athlete who consumes 25 megajoules of energy throughout the day. If less than 10%, which is already very little, comes from protein, they are easily consuming 3 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. And they're not huge. So in other words, there's no issues there. But I would never advocate huge amounts of proteins to be consumed next to the diet, of course.
Thanks for that, Prof. Luc. So our next question is from David, who asked, what are some of the major molecular and cellular mechanisms responsible for anabolic resistance during aging, and how may this be overcome?
Yeah, very good question. We don't know, because we don't even know whether it's anabolic pathways that are responsible for the anabolic resistance. Because as I said, it could be the perfusion of your tissues. It could be the amino acid uptake of the tissues. It could be the signaling inside the muscle. We don't know where it is. The only thing that we know with aging, that at least that the anabolic response, so the stimulation of the mTOR pathway, is a little bit delayed. But that's based on biopsies that are being taken in time. And so if you take a muscle biopsy at a certain point in time, then in the elderly, you see a lesser anabolic signaling response. But whether that is different than half an hour before and half an hour after that, we don't know. But in general, the anabolic resistance seems to be largely or completely overcome by physical activity. If you have an older person that does physical activity, we see that the anabolic resistance goes away. So the question is actually, is there anabolic resistance of aging, or is it anabolic resistance of a reduced physical activity? That's the big question. And I believe firmly that most of it is the reduction in physical activity.
So, but we can test that.
Thanks for sharing.
We can test it by simply having older people exercise and see that the anabolic response to feeding is completely normalized.
Right.
That's what we see.
Yeah. So it's not aging, but it's our behavior.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting perspective. Indeed. So we have another question from Colin, who said, in model organisms, the health effects and longevity from dietary restrictions are mediated by lower intake of protein. Do you think that is not the case in humans?
Very difficult question to address. But even if you go for the energy intake restriction and longevity, from the original studies in rodents, we actually saw that the group that was energy restricted was also more physically active. So in fact, if you don't overfeed the animals, they start looking for food and become active again. So the control group was actually overfed and lethargic and sitting in a corner and not doing what a rodent is normally doing, running around and being active. So my take on some of those studies is that the control group was actually unhealthy and the energy restriction was actually the healthy group. The question is, how do you define energy restriction? If you actually tell me on the definition, you will live longer when you eat 20% less protein or less energy or protein than you need, I would say that doesn't make sense, because if you eat less than what you need, you die. But the question is, what is required? And that is a difficult question.
All right, thanks for sharing that, Prof. Luc. We have one more question from David, who asked, is there a gender difference with regards to anabolic resistance in muscles during aging?
Yeah, very good question. There's not a lot of studies. We're now doing a lot of studies where we compare men and women, or actually we include both men and women in the studies. And so far, we've only done one study, and the women, as always, responded faster and stronger to the same stimulus. So they seem to respond fast. Is that because they live healthier, that they are more active, or that we actually provided them with more protein when expressed to their total amount of muscle? Because we compared 20 grams in both men and women. But of course, 20 grams based on the total amount of muscle mass is more for the women than for the men. So only half an answer to your question here.
But that's okay. Thanks for sharing your perspective, Prof. Luc. And we have one participant who asked, do you believe in a one-size-fits-all approach regarding nutrition and rehab, or a patient-specific approach?
I think that with the ratio between endurance and resistance type exercise that I just discussed with Andrea, it's quite clear that if you actually try to monitor or support or coach a patient or an athlete, it has to be individualized and personalized.
May I ask, Luc, how would you personalize it now in clinical practice? Because most of the times we give 3 times the supplements of 200 cc of a certain amount of proteins, etc. Would you use ventilated hoods, for example, to see what really the calories are you need, and then convert it a little bit to proteins? What's your approach?
Now, for example, in the intensive care, I think that the ventilated hoods would be very interesting to look at energy expenditure, because different diseases in the intensive care have huge effects on energy requirements. But if we talk about rehabilitation after, for example, elective surgery, I think one of the most important questions is, why did somebody get a new hip or a new knee, and what does he want to do with it? Because the past generation, it was to not have any pain. Nowadays, the generation that comes in for a new knee or a new hip is a generation that wants to go skiing with the grandchildren again. So basically, you have to listen. What is the aim? What was the previous physical capacity of that person, and where does that person after the surgery want to go to? And that requires a different approach. It's the same as an athlete, a recreational athlete that just wants to lose a little bit of weight, or an athlete that wants to win the Olympics. The training and the support must be different between the two.
All right, thanks, Prof. Luc, for that. We have Vijay, who asked, are there conditions in which a nutritional or endocrine signal actually affect muscle function but not muscle mass?
Sure. There must be, but I mean, if you give me an hour to think about it, I could come up with a few examples. But I guess there are. I mean, anything that will actually affect central nervous system or neuromuscular signaling. So the capacity. I mean, anything that works on the nerves will probably have an effect. Could have an effect on the neuromuscular system and not on the muscle, and the other way around. So there should be some, but I can't think of one specific one now immediately.
Okay, Clarissa, last question.
All right. Oh, wow. Okay. We have Jiwanadi, who asked, can you explain the rationale of pre-sleep protein intake and muscle mass gain, where often there's no room for exercise when it is pre-sleep?
Yeah. So first thing that before I answer that question, do understand that you don't need to do exercise before a meal in order to have that benefit. If you do exercise today, you will also have a greater response to breakfast tomorrow morning. So the positive effect of exercise will weigh through several meals. That's why we need to do exercise every day or every other day in order to maximize the benefits. Now, the impact of pre-sleep feeding is, there's two approaches. One is we have in the hospital, you have your last meal maybe at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you're overnight fasted until the next day, 9 o'clock, which is not a good thing because that's too much time to actually lose muscle. And when we're fasted, we actually lose more muscle. We net lose muscle. So in those conditions, especially in the conditions where you're at higher risk of losing muscle, use some extra protein prior to sleep in order to maintain muscle protein synthesis and attenuate muscle protein breakdown. Now, you can use this in the hospital, and we've done that before by healthy elderly, putting there with a nasogastric tube. Not advocating this is only for the study. So putting a nasogastric tube in there, making them sleep, and then we provided the intrinsically labeled protein at 2 o'clock at night while they were sleeping. And we woke them up in the morning with a muscle biopsy to see that the protein that was actually provided at 2 o'clock was actually digested and absorbed and used to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So we have proof that the gastrointestinal tract works while we sleep. So you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis during sleep. Now, you can use this also for athletes that, for example, want to recover faster. And that's also a strategy to support recovery after exercise. And of course, many of us will exercise in the evening after dinner. And then it's smart to take some protein after that exercise bout to support the repair of muscle damage and to accommodate the adaptive response of your muscle.
Thank you so much, Luc. I think I learned you are what you eat, and you should stay subscribed to the gym if you just recently subscribed. And very often this is happening in the new year, and the muscle mass will come, I think. So first the strength and then the mass. So thank you so much. Hopefully you enjoyed, as listeners, as I did, this wonderful discussion. Please use the chat function, the panelists and all attendees option to leave feedback, which is highly appreciated, and comments. And look also for some news of our center in our School of Medicine after the end credits. And of course, you might want to know who is the next speaker in our next session. So the next session will be on the 10th of February, because we are celebrating the Lunar New Year in the first week of February. And the next speaker will be Professor Björn Schumacher from Germany. And as always, we are ending this session with a video, and this time with a video from 2 News Oklahoma about a very special instructor, which was quite aged. So I will leave you. Stay healthy and take care.
Jerry Dunbar is sassy.
Do you want me to throw you a kiss?
Spirited.
Count! 1, 2.
And maybe Oklahoma's oldest aerobics instructor.
I'm 86. It's just a number. 3, 2.
From push-ups to planks,
10 more. 10.
Jerry's a fitness inspiration.
There's nobody like Jerry.
Jerry started teaching in her 60s and has been going strong for 25 years.
Work it up.
The only fitness break this 80-something Energizer bunny has taken
Now reach.
was after a serious diagnosis several years ago.
They found a spot on one of my breasts. So I said, okay, what do we do? Let's have a mastectomy. And I'm thinking, okay. Went in, had it. I was back teaching in a month.
Jerry begins each class with prayer, grateful for her health and her students.
Thank you for being in our heart. Amen. Okay, let's do it. And I don't charge for this class.
So why do you?
It's my heart. It makes me filled with joy.
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down.